Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. Welcome to The Analytic Christian, where we explore topics in Christian philosophy and theology. Today we're going to be talking about dualism and maybe some evidence against it or arguments against it. I'm joined by Dr. Dustin Crummett. He's been on the channel several times, so I won't give another introduction. Welcome back, Dustin. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, so I had a patron submit an Ask a Scholar question here. And it was two questions, but they're related, so I'm going to go ahead and read them both out. Question number one, what is the interaction problem for dualism, and what's the best way a dualist can respond to it? And then question number two, there are cases where humans have suffered a brain injury, like a nail spike through the brain, or some type of abnormality in the brain, like a tumor, and it appears to completely alter or diminish their entire personality. Does this evidence show that substance dualism is probably false and physicalism is probably true? Okay. How would you like to respond?
Yeah. So I guess I'll take them one at a time. So what is the interaction problem? I wish I knew. It's kind of hard to figure out what the problem is. It's something to do with the question: how is it that the soul and the body can interact if the soul is this separate immaterial substance, right? Okay, so that's a question. What is the problem, right? I mean, how does anything interact, right? Like, what's the problem? I think, on my view, originally it was quite clear what the problem was when it was first formulated, and nowadays, in light of modern science and philosophical developments, it's much less clear. So maybe I'll say what I think the problem originally was and why that's no longer a problem, and then I'll say how you might try to reformulate it, right? So the interaction problem, as we know it, at least as far as I know, it goes back to Elizabeth of Bohemia, who was a princess of Bohemia, and was also a philosopher. And she had a famous correspondence with Descartes. Descartes, big defender of Cartesian dualism, substance dualism. And she points out this problem for Descartes. And this is the problem. Descartes believed, this is all a bit simplified, but Descartes believed roughly, like a lot of people, a lot of philosophers in that period, that like physical causation, and particularly making something else move, that's always the result of like pushing, so to speak, right? It's the result, you can imagine like a billiard ball that's struck by another billiard ball. The causation is always a matter of like one object pushing another one. And actually, it's sort of like an a priori truth that that's all that it can be. And it's also an a priori truth that, like, basically you could deduce from knowledge of, the two objects, the shape of each one, how big each one is, their vectors, that sort of stuff. From that, you could deduce like what the effect will be, right? Like, in principle, you could, just by thinking about it, never even having seen billiard balls. If I just told you this one's traveling at this speed, whatever, you could work out, okay, it's going to hit it, it's going to knock it off this way, whatever, right? So this is a popular account of physical causation. It's one that Descartes seems to accept. Okay, Descartes believes that I am this non-physical soul that's not spatially located. Well, how can that cause anything to happen in my body, right? Given this account of physical causation. It can't touch it, doesn't have a shape, doesn't have a vector, it can't push things around. So if causing things to move It's like always a matter of like pushing them, touching them, and pushing them. And my soul can't touch things and I can't push them. How does it make my body move around, right? Elizabeth wrote about this problem to Descartes, and Descartes actually didn't really have a good answer. And so that's the interaction problem, right? As it initially was stated. And there it was a very reasonable, okay, you can see what the problem is, right? Nowadays, though, we don't accept that account of physical causation, right? One thing you might notice if you think about it is that also leads to like the gravity interaction problem, right? I mean, the sun is like 93 million miles away from me. You're telling me it's causing the Earth to like go one direction rather than another one. How does that make any sense? Isaac Newton, when he developed the theory of gravity, he was aware of this problem, and he actually says, yeah, obviously it is impossible for like one physical object to causally affect another one without touching it or having some medium in between them. And what that shows is that gravity has to be the result of like divine action. God is everywhere, so he can push the planets around. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, we don't accept that, right? There's actually a question about, in light of relativity and like thinking of gravity as a result of the curvature of space-time, there's a question about whether gravity really requires action at a distance without a medium, but quantum mechanics probably does. We don't believe that physical causation is always a matter of like one thing touching another one and pushing it. So like scientifically, that account, not very serious. And then philosophically, Hume came along and he said, well, like, wait a minute, could you actually a priori deduce what is going to happen when the one billiard ball hit the other one? I mean, you've seen it happen a bunch, so you know what will happen. Mm-hmm. And that makes you feel like you could deduce it a priori. That makes you feel like there's some metaphysical necessity here. But like, if you had never seen it happen before, wouldn't it be just as conceivable that like they just pass through each other, or like the one just stops when it touches the other one, or like they both vanish? You know, I mean, anything could happen, right? It just seems like it has to happen this way because we've seen it so much. So Hume says, like, wait a minute, what is causation? Like the one thing making another thing happen, what is that? How does it do that? What we in fact see are like constant conjunctions. We see one thing happens and another one happens. We can break them down into mechanisms sometimes. You know, when I like, how does me touching the phone screen make a phone call happen? You can talk about the internal mechanisms of the phone, but like at base, you know, like a quark interacting with the field or whatever, how does it do that? Whatever happens at the fundamental level, looks like we'd have to say, oh, there's not really anything informative to say, right? You can't really answer that question. It just does. Yeah. Like it exercises a causal power. Okay.
Right. That's what I was thinking. It just seems like it'd just be a basic power. It's not reducible to anything else. It just seems like that's the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah. So it looks like we grant that like action can happen without things touching each other. We grant that causation actually is kind of obscure, that at some point you can't really answer the how question. Well, now what is the problem with the soul interacting with the body, right? We agree it doesn't have to touch it. We agree maybe it just acts via a basic power, right? In the way that whatever the fundamental physical causation has to be. And so like that used to be the interaction problem. Not a problem anymore because we've rejected the assumptions that generate the problem. What is the problem now? Sometimes people just express incredulity or, you know, it's like they say, well, they just seem too different. You know, the thought is like very different things couldn't causally interact. But like, why couldn't very different things causally interact? I mean, particles and fields interact. They're different. Like my hand is very different from the phone, you know? So like, why couldn't, I mean, that's just kind of, that's an assertion that they couldn't interact. There are more detailed. I mean, sometimes people worry about the laws of nature. Would it violate conservation of energy if they causally interacted? And there are two things for a dualist to say there. Some people have come up with, I think Robin Collins maybe has a paper about this. A lot of people have come up with ways that maybe actually it wouldn't violate causation of energy if the interaction happens in the right way. You might also think, well, okay, you know, physical laws govern interactions between physical objects. This is a different sort of case where the one place where a soul is interacting with things. Maybe it's not that weird if the ordinary physical laws don't apply in this case. You might sorry, my cat was licking
That's
something.
fine.
What do we have?
I like that chair. That seems like a really comfy chair.
Sorry, he was trying to eat this hairband.
No.
Fortunately, I got it from him before.
It looks like half of it's missing.
But no, it's just broken.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But sorry, what was I saying? Oh yeah. Okay. So sometimes people will say things like, well, anything that can interact with a physical object is by definition a physical object. It's kind of like, well, I mean, you can stipulate that that's how you're using the word physical, and I'll just be like, okay, so by that definition, maybe the soul is physical. It's just this very odd physical thing that's an essentially simple mental substance that you know. Yeah, it's quite difficult. It's quite difficult to like really generate a worrisome version of the problem, to my mind. The most serious attempt is probably from Jaegwon Kim. He wrote about what he calls the pairing problem. Josh Rasmussen and Andrew Bailey and who else?
I'm trying to remember. I know what you're talking about.
Luke Van Horn.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
They have a paper responding to that. That's
I think it's called. Is it called no pairing problem?
It's called no pairing problem. Yeah. So people can look that up if they want the more sophisticated version of the problem and the response to it. But yeah, I think, I mean, to my mind, it's quite difficult to really state the interaction problem in a way that isn't just fist pounding assertion, but that also, you know, makes sense as like a plausible argument.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably enough. This isn't meant to be like the definitive answer to the interaction problem, but enough to get this patron an idea of what the problem is supposed to be and where to look for further resources. I'm sure, I haven't looked it up, but I'm sure that there's probably like a Stanford encyclopedia entry on either on substance dualism where the interaction problems discussed. They might look at that, but also maybe that Kim paper and then the Rasmussen Van Horn paper. That's probably the most serious.
Yeah, Kim and Kim himself says, like, I'm trying to actually give an argument. Often when people talk about the interaction problem, it's nothing but like they just express a sense of dissatisfaction. So he actually tries to give an argument. Oftentimes there's not really that much of an argument to my mind. So if you don't immediately grasp this intuition that how could they possibly interact, there's not so much to move. So this other question was about like the Phineas gauge.
Right, Phineas gauge with the nail spike. But also, I can't remember the specific person, but I heard about this case, I think a couple years ago, where there was somebody that got this brain tumor and then they went out and like killed somebody. And they were like a very kind, they would never do that sort of thing. But because of this brain tumor, they did something like that. So do those cases, we were like, how can we state the problem for the interaction problem? I think the problem here may be a little easier to state. It's like, maybe we want to say like, on physicalism, that isn't so surprising, but on dualism, that is more surprising. So this seems like it would be evidence for physicalism. What do you think of that?
Yeah. So, this isn't quite the interaction problem to my mind. This is the problem of like the dependence of the mind on the brain. The fact that your mind seems to depend on your brain, that doesn't immediately show that you just are your brain, right? If you drive a spike through my heart, that will also have a big impact on my personality, right? It will do away with it. But yeah, if there's this close relationship, doesn't it seem most likely that that's because they are the same thing, as opposed to like there being this immaterial soul? So yeah, the dualist will have to say that uh, the mind and the brain have this very close relationship, right? And you don't even, I mean, you don't need the Phineas Gage case or anything in modern neuroscience or whatever to tell. I mean, people have always understood, like, yeah, if you get hit in the head, that can knock you out. I mean, you drink alcohol, it causes physical changes in your body, and that causes mental changes, right? So yeah, the dualist will have to say there's some very close relationship between your soul and your brain, such that, like, in some sense, your brain like performs a lot of your mental operations, or it has some sort of causal impact on your soul in such a way that uh, yeah, that changes to your brain affect your soul, affect your mind. Destroying your brain takes away your consciousness, even if your soul continues to exist. Changing your brain a lot can change your personality, change your mental life. Yeah, so there are a couple things to say. I mean, one option for a dualist would be to say, yeah, it's true. I have to posit this close relationship between soul and brain. And that's like an additional posit that sort of lowers the probability of the theory because it's not entailed just by dualism. On dualism, it seems initially possible that, say, if you destroyed my brain, I would just float around like Casper or something, right? Or, my body really would just be a puppet, and nothing you could do to it would like change my personality. It just, yeah, I mean, that seems conceivable if dualism is true. So dualism doesn't predict with probability 1 that changes to my brain will affect my personality and such. Arguably, physicalism does. So, like Bayesianism, that's some evidence for physicalism. One evidence for the dualist would be to say, yeah, fair enough. That's some evidence for physicalism. And I think that there are other reasons that are stronger to be a dualist. Some dualists have tried to give versions of dualism that they think like do a better job of predicting the dependence relation. So people like William Hasker defend emergent dualism, where the thought is the mind is this separate mental substance, but it's somehow generated or caused to exist by the physical. And they think, and presumably, I guess they're thinking that kind of makes it seem more likely that big changes to the physical will result in big changes to the soul. Another possibility so I was thinking about this the other day after you asked me this question. You might question whether physicalism actually does predict with probability 1 that changes to my brain will result in changes to my mind. For reasons that are a little bit similar to what Brian Cutter and I say about physicalism in our psychophysical harmony paper, for people who are familiar with that.
I will mention I've done an interview with you. In fact, I'll throw down the gauntlet. I was the first one to do the interview with you. So if you want to hear that, I'll link it up above.
Yeah. So, I mean, you might think like, well, just as a conceptual matter, like physicalism doesn't, I mean, so that there are these like, you tell me, okay, so like there's consciousness in the world and the conscious objects are physical objects. You might think that doesn't itself tell you that the consciousness is going to reside in brains, right? Like you could imagine all sorts of physical objects being conscious. You could, Galen Strawson sometimes, I think he kind of makes people a little mad. He says like, the view that consciousness is physical is no more plausible than the view that consciousness is pizza. And apart from whether that's right, You could imagine like, well, yeah, what if like pizzas were conscious? What if like other sorts of information bearing systems were conscious? What if there was no macro level consciousness? Like only panpsychism was true, like the particles were
Yeah.
conscious. Yeah. All of those things seem conceptually possible. For a physicalist, of course, a lot of them are not metaphysically possible. They're not like really possible. But you might think, well, if they're actually conceptually possible, then like on the epistemic level, physicalism doesn't predict with probability 1 that there's this dependence between consciousness and brains. It does once you add a further posit about, oh, it's a specific type of physicalism. But of course, dualism predicts the dependence once you add the further posit too, right? That, okay, mind's dependent. So yeah, I'm not totally sure about that, but I used to think it was clear that this was like some decent evidence. Sorry, now my cat's getting into boxes. I used to think it was fairly clear that this was like some decent evidence for physicalism, and I just thought it was outweighed by other things. Now it's kind of less obvious to me whether that's so. I mean, someone who's a type A physicalist will deny that these other things are even conceptually possible, but physicalists who
Can
agree
you?
that they're conceptually possible.
I may actually be able to turn this into a little short. So if you can be super concise within 60 seconds, that'd be awesome. What's the distinction between type A physicalism and type B physicalism?
Yeah. Roughly, type A physicalists deny that there's, or I mean, what's important about it is type A physicalists deny that there's an epistemic gap between the physical and the phenomenal. So either they'll think like the phenomenal consciousness, like it doesn't exist, or, it doesn't exist in the way you think or something, or they'll think that it's like an a priori truth that conceptually it just is being in a certain functional state or whatever the physical basis is. There's like a conceptual connection between the physical and the mental, such that scenarios where physical facts are the same but mental facts are different, those are like not even conceptually
they're
possible.
impossible.
Whereas, they're not even conceivable. You can't even imagine, say, a zombie who is physically just
seems wild to me. Like I can clearly conceive of it.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of would be like, what do you? I mean, I'm doing it right now, right? Type B physicalists will say, no, that's not right. Those things are conceivable, but some things are conceivable, but not really possible. You could conceive of water being something other than H2O. And in fact, people throughout history did all the time, right? They thought it was all kinds of stuff. But really, water, it just is H2O. And so it can't be something other than H2O, right? Then it wouldn't be water anymore if it wasn't H2O. And they'll say in the same way, yeah, I grant you can conceive of the physical and the mental coming apart in all these different ways. I grant that there's no conceptual link between facts characterized in the terms of physical science and facts characterized in mental terms. But actually, these are the same thing at the end.
Yeah. Now, going back to your point,
going back to my point, I was suggesting a type B physicalist who grants that there's this conceptual gap. Maybe their view actually doesn't imply dependence of mind on the brain, unless you add some further stuff, right? And then it becomes less clear that it actually supports that view. So the thought would be, again, I just thought of this the other day. I haven't run past anyone. Maybe I'm wrong. But the thought would be type A physicalism, that definitely implies dependence of the mind on the brain, at least given, given the assumption that, you really can't imagine. Yeah, okay. That definitely applies dependence of the mind on the brain. But then it seems to be false, seems to be not correct, that you can't conceive of these other things. Whereas type B physicalism doesn't itself imply dependence without further posits. And then maybe it's, well, okay, dualism can also imply dependence if you have further posits.
I see.
So that's, again, I'm not 100% sure of that, but there might be something to that line of reasoning. I think the best arguments in this area are the argument from dependence, and then there might be some sort of argument from just like, we haven't found any direct scientific evidence of like non-physical interaction, And I do think that that's pretty weak too, because would you expect us to have found it at this point? I mean, you know, you if you could like model everything that's happening in my brain, and like when, according to the laws of physics, every neuron would fire, and then you found out, oh, everything perfectly matches, there's no room, then you could rule out uh, non-physical causation. But of course, we can't even do that for like one neuron, right? Like, how are we going to do that for all of them? But you know, you could at least imagine ways in which the soul and the mind and the body could interact that would leave some kind of empirically detectable whatever. And I guess we know that that's not true, at least so far as we've found. So I do think there may be some slight empirical evidence in favor of physicalism. But I don't think that it's prohibitive. I don't think that it's super strong, and I'm inclined to think that's outweighed by other stuff. That's roughly where I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, I guess to sum up the whole discussion would be, it's not clear what the interaction problem is supposed to be, and probably the best version of the interaction problem is Kim's pairing problem, but that has really good responses.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the gist from the first bit.
Yes.
The second is, you can say this is some evidence for physicalism, but we've got lots more evidence, or more weighty evidence, in favor of dualism. So that's fine. That's one type of response. The second type of response is to give a version of dualism, like property dualism, and say, well, you know, if that's the case on that dualistic picture, it's not unlikely that, or it doesn't seem as problematic to that, you know, a spike through the brain would affect the mental or something. The third consideration is, it's not so obvious that on physicalism that it's you would expect this sort of thing, the diminishment of the personality, whatever, due to some event in the brain, or something abnormal going on in the brain. Do you think that was a fair summary?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I was tracking with you. All right. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, Dustin. And for the viewers, I'll mention, check out my interview with Dustin on psychophysical harmony and how this can be evidence for theism. I think that's the only interview I've done with you on this topic. We've done some others, but not about mind-body stuff. So, all right, I'll leave it there. Thank you for watching, and keep exploring Christianity.